this as an opportunity to introduce some of the concepts and lay out the entire series. To do that, I'm going to start off with the cell cycle. Now, you don't need to know this in great detail because we're going to discuss the cell cycle and cell cycle regulation in lessons number 6 and 7. But to refresh you, there's a mitosis phase, a synthesis phase. Between mitosis and synthesis is a G1, and between synthesis and mitosis, a G2. Now, as a cell proliferates, especially during development, it may differentiate, become a cell that doesn't need to proliferate anymore. When that happens, it goes into a quiescent state in the G0 phase. Some cells, when they go into G0, stay there and never come out. Those are going to be known as permanent cells. There are more permanent cell types than this, but the ones you should commit to memory are going to be cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and brain, which is why heart attacks and strokes are such a big deal. If those cells die, they're gone forever. On the opposite side of the spectrum are those cells that are continuously proliferating. They stay in the cell cycle most of the time. These cells are going to be known as labile cells. Labile cells spend almost no time in G0. And the cells that require constant turnover are going to be those cells that are going to be like epithelial layers that are sort of sloughing off and constantly regenerating. Labile cells that you should remember are going to be the hair, skin, and GI tract. Sometimes there are cells that have differentiated into an organ. They don't need to proliferate, so they're not. Most of their time is spent doing whatever the organ needs them to do. But if there were an injury to the organ, those cells can be induced out of G0 back into the cell cycle. Most tissues do this. These are stable cells. If you're not permanent and you're not labile, you're stable. Most famously is the liver. The liver's capacity for regeneration is extraordinarily high, such that if you take a huge chunk, the hepatocytes will simply proliferate and fill in the space. Other tissues like lung and kidney, if they are damaged, they can regenerate because their cells can be induced to proliferate. Permanent cells, when lost, can only scar. But once those stable cells have filled in the gap, they stop proliferating and can go back into G0. Labile cells and stable cells are capable of using all adaptations because adaptations involve both changes in cell size and number. Because they have proliferations, they can change. Labile cells and stable cells can use all cellular adaptations, whereas permanent cells, because they cannot re-enter the cell cycle, can only use hypertrophy and atrophy. Because they are proliferating, labile cells, more so than stable cells, are vulnerable to malignant transformation. The more cell divisions you have, the more DNA replications occur, the more opportunity you have for a mishap. Labile cells, most vulnerable to malignant transformation. And labile cells are most vulnerable to chemotherapy because most chemotherapy targets mitotically active cells, which is why you'll see cancer patients stigmatized as people with no hair puking all over the place. Whereas permanent cells, which do not enter a proliferative phase, have the lowest chance of malignant transformation and generally are spared the consequence of chemotherapy. We'll discuss chemotherapy more later on in this course. So what are these cellular adaptations? Well, when a cell suffers an insult, if that insult is small, so the cell can tolerate it, it will then do one of these adaptations. And the adaptations is the discussion of this entire lesson. But if that insult is really big, more so than the cell can tolerate, that cell is going to die. But die doesn't mean the same thing. If there is tremendous amount of force and the cell didn't see it coming and all of a sudden, poof, dead, explodes all over the place, that's called necrosis. And we'll discuss that in the lesson that follows this one. But if the cell recognizes that it's damaged and realizes that it is incapable of making the repairs, rather than harming the host organism, it just says, you know what, I'm out, backs away, decomposes itself, and removes its lineage. That's what happens in apoptosis, also called apoptosis. After the cell dies, or many cells die, the organ says, well, hey, I'm missing some, can you fix me? The cells that remain can be induced to heal a wound or to regenerate. Wound healing is going to be the subject of lesson number 5. And the reason why this is relevant is because adaptation, self-sacrifice, repair, these mechanisms can go awry, and what happens is when they are hijacked, they can lead to malignancy. Hold on to malignancy for a second. Let's come back to the adaptations. Here we have a normal epithelium, and it's easier to do this with epithelia, just easier to show on the board. These cells are equal to each other, size and shape. They are normal. If a stressor comes and it's not so bad that it causes the cells to die, the cells can adapt. If the cells adapt by changing the cell number, that is, instead of the 3 we had to start, we get extra. This is called hyperplasia. Hyperplasia is famously tested in 3 conditions. That is phenytoin-induced gingival hyperplasia, tobacco smoking leading to an increased in mucus production from goblet cells, hyperplasia, and in the disease called benign prostatic hypertrophy. Hypertrophy, explain in a second. The thing that causes men to not be able to pee is actually hyperplasia. Too many cells squeeze the urethra. The organ gets bigger, and as we'll see in a second, hypertrophy of the organ only means organ gets bigger. Organs can get bigger by cells getting bigger or having more cells. The cellular response by an increase in number is called hyperplasia. If instead the cell size changes, you can have either hypertrophy or atrophy. In hypertrophy, the cells get bigger. In atrophy, the cells get smaller. Still all same to each other, just relative to the normal state, they get bigger in hypertrophy and smaller in atrophy. Cells hypertrophy and atrophy by increasing or decreasing the amount of cytoplasm they have, and their activity is by changing the number of organelles. Permanent cells can only respond with hypertrophy or atrophy. The classic example is a bodybuilder. Takes the weight, squeezes it over time, gets bigger muscles. That getting bigger muscles is the organ hypertrophying. An organ can hypertrophy or atrophy by increasing in the number of cells or by increasing in the size of cells. In general, you should think of hypertrophy and atrophy at the cellular level. Skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and brain can only hypertrophy and atrophy. In dementia, you get brain atrophy. When that bodybuilder is squeezing the weights, the organ, the muscle is getting bigger because the cells are getting bigger, because they're having more sarcomeres and more sarcoplasmic reticulum to increase the force of contractility of the skeletal muscle. If that bodybuilder stops working out, the muscles get smaller, his muscles get smaller because the cells get smaller. Atrophy is classically used in skeletal muscle in relation to de-innervation, which is why when you see a patient who's been paralyzed from the waist down from a spinal cord injury, they might have a solid upper body where they still have control, but in the wheelchair their legs are really skinny because they don't use them. Atrophy, you don't use it, you lose it. Things get smaller. Hypertrophy gets bigger under stress. The danger, though, is that cardiac muscle, being permanent, can increase in size when you have hypertension. Left ventricular hypertrophy is an adaptive response to the cell, but it may cause problems for the patient. These are in green because these are not premalignant. Even though hyperplasia means increased proliferation and more opportunity for DNA repair failures, hyperplasia is not premalignant. BPH, even though the organ hypertrophies, is because of increased number of cells, but BPH never leads to prostate cancer. Another adaptive response to the cell's perspective is when it changes from whatever it was to a different type of cell. A change in cell type is called metaplasia. This is where the normal epithelium changes to a different normal epithelium. Classic examples of this are going to be Barrett's esophagus, HPV on the cervix, and in the lung. Metaplasia is one good epithelium changing to another. The best example is Barrett's. The normal squamous epithelium of the lower esophagus not supposed to see acid. The columnar and goblet cells of the duodenum see acid all the time. Stomach acid is made in the stomach and goes down. For someone who has reflux, that acid comes back up. That squamous epithelium says, what the hell with this, I'm tired of being splashed with acid. And it switches from the doesn't like acid squamous epithelium to the columnar doesn't mind acid epithelium of the duodenum. That's a re-differentiation. You take a differentiated cell, you have it behave differently, accessing different DNA, expressing different genes. Sounds a lot like what cancer is. Metaplasia itself is not premalignant, but people with Barrett's esophagus are 40 times more likely to develop malignant transformation. Metaplasia is the changing of the cell type, but each cell type behaves as it's supposed to. It's just that it had undergone a change in the location. So we find epithelium in a space you're not supposed to find it. Dysplasia is on its way to cancer. Dysplasia is defined by the loss of polarity and cell shape. The original cells pointed up at their apex. They were attached to the basement membrane, the black line, at the bottom. They were next to each other. Dysplastic tissue begins to lose the cell shape, size, and polarity. Dysplasia becomes cancer. But you don't have to go metaplasia to dysplasia. You can go straight from normal cells to unregulated growth, called neoplasia. Now be careful. Neoplasia does not mean malignancy. In the vernacular, we throw around cancer, tumor, malignancy, neoplasia to mean the same thing. But technically, neoplasia is clonal proliferation, unregulated growth. If you tackle on top of that dysplasia, you have the thing that's about to become malignancy. You've got loss of cell polarity, unregulated growth. That's neoplasia. Neoplasia means unregulated differentiation, therefore more opportunities to turn dysplastic. Dysplasia sets up the opportunities to dysregulate the cell cycle and have unregulated proliferation. Neoplastic or dysplastic tissue becomes malignant through a series of steps that we'll explore in lessons 8, 9, and 10. Biology of cancer. Once a tissue is capable of invading the basement membrane and metastasizing elsewhere, it's malignant. But a lot of things have to go wrong from metaplastic or normal tissue to end up at malignancy. Neoplasia is unregulated growth. It could be benign or it could be malignant. And usually things that are benign do not become malignant. But as you begin to study, be careful of the words people use. Dysplasia is pre-malignancy. Neoplasia opens up the opportunity for dysplasia leading to malignancy. Being dysplastic can open up the door for unregulated cell growth. We're going to close this course with what we as providers need to do for patients, sort of the epidemiology and screening and treatment of cancer. Let's review. This is an introductory lesson. Really, it's about cellular adaptation. What we did was introduce 3 types of cells. Permanent cells that cannot go back into the cell cycle, cardiac, skeletal muscle, and brain. They can only hypertrophy and atrophy. Stable cells are quiescent. They stay in G0 most of the time, unless they are induced to proliferate. Most tissues do this. Labile cells are almost always in the cell cycle, hair, skin, GI. If a cell suffers a significant injury beyond what it can tolerate, it's either so severe that it explodes, necrosis, or it's so bad that it can't repair itself, apoptosis. When cells die, organs are deficient, and so they attempt to repair themselves with wound healing of a scar or reproliferation. All of these things, if they break, can end up in cancer, malignancy. The cellular adaptations are hyperplasia, when the number of cells increase, the size does not. Phenytoin gingival hyperplasia, smoking goblet cells, and benign prostatic hyperplasia. Also called hypertrophy because organs can hypertrophy by hyperplasia. The cellular adaptation that increases or decreases cell size without changing cell number is hypertrophy and atrophy. What makes them bigger or smaller is more cytoplasm or less, more organelles or less. Another adaptation is metaplasia, where the cell changes from one differentiated type to another differentiated type, not pre-malignant. Dysplasia is pre-malignant. Loss of polarity, loss of regularity of the size and shape. The epithelial layer gets all crazy. More on this later. Neoplasia is unregulated clonal proliferation. Neoplasia and dysplasia are different. Both of them together end up with malignancy. But in order to become malignant from just a growth, you have to have a few things happen first. That's the introduction to inflammation and neoplasia. Cellular adaptation.